Hello, students of the 510 courses. We're going to take this opportunity today to introduce to you the critical thinking and critical reading skills that you'll be required to use in this course. It's important that we all begin with the same idea of what we're defining. If we look at the course description, which you probably all have done by this point, you'll see that the course goal is to identify and review scholarly literature, critically evaluate research, and develop skills to write an effective literature review. The course level learning outcomes directly related to critical thinking and reading include critically evaluate the quality of different forms of educational research. You see the word critically evaluate there. Also, evaluate claims and construct arguments about educational research. The words evaluate and construct involve critical thinking. Demonstrate the ability to synthesize rather than summarize. They're not the same skill. Demonstrate the ability to integrate divergent perspectives on a research topic related to a problem of practice. And lastly, demonstrate an informed understanding about a research topic related to a problem of practice that incorporates one of your areas of concern. These skills particularly involve critical thinking and critical reading. The interesting thing about that skill is that about those skills, is that very rarely can we really describe what critical thinking is. If you look at what critical thinking is, and I don't know why we're getting that funny line. There we go. Paul and Elder in 2013 did research where they looked at 38 public universities and 28 private universities to determine how much emphasis faculty put on critical thinking and what their understanding of critical thinking really was. How did they understand it? How did they define it? And how did they describe it to their students? Interestingly enough, they found that rarely were faculty able to define what critical thinking is. Think about your own students in your own courses. We all want our students to engage in critical thinking. Common Core standards tell us that we need to do that. We want you to engage in critical thinking. And all of us claim to be able to engage in critical thinking, but can we define what it is? What are the components? We're going to discuss that momentarily. There is some common ground from the literature. The literature tells us that every topic, every subject is organized, synthesized, maintained, transformed, and understood by critical thinking. And yet we all have a difficult time describing what that is. What kind of critical thinking or what kind of thinking currently prevails? Unfortunately, the crucial need for ever new models of thinking require us to adapt to new problems and situations in society at large. Think about watching the news. Think about when you're watching people stand behind a podium or standing in the street with a microphone in their hand or talking to news reporters. How often you think, that doesn't make a lot of sense. There's no logic behind that. Unfortunately, short-term thinking and quick fix solutions still rule the day. Most often, What we hear on the news or we read in the newspapers involves that kind of thinking, but it doesn't involve critical thinking. Traditionally, in our way of thinking, the thinking's been designed for routine, for habit, for automation. Think about when you got your undergrad degree in college. You had a set of behaviors, a set of thinking that you thought, okay, when I begin the classroom, this is what I do. And year after year, I'll be able to do the same thing. But that's not the case anymore. Requirements for our thinking processes have changed because what we used to be able to do and the way we used to think about topics or work, etc., has radically changed. Our thinking must also change. So, what kind of thought processes are necessary if we're going to engage in critical thinking? Now, let's take a look at a mind node that will help us understand the components or the underlying thinking. Here we go. If we think about the process of critical thinking, these are the skills that we must not use as a checklist, but must rather incorporate into everything we think about. They must become a habit for us. Let's see if I can move this over for all of you so we can all see it. This is a brand new program, so we're going to use it for the first time today. Process of critical thinking then involves analyzing what we hear, what we observe, and what we read. Analyzing means taking it apart. So you can't read an article and say, okay, I'm done with that one. As you read that article, you're going to be analyzing it. As you take notes, for example, take a look at what kinds of themes seem to be coming to the top. Every research article you read will have a couple, for sure, or maybe more themes that they include. And as you take note, make note of those themes. As you read more articles and more research, you'll be engaging in synthesis. In other words, you'll take the themes from one source, and then as you read a second or third or 10th source, what themes seem to be in common? What kinds of information do they discuss? What kinds of things seem important in those articles? So you'll analyze them and then you'll synthesize them. You will put them together, only you'll put them together on a conceptual basis by themes. So as you read, you'll be analyzing, synthesizing, and interpreting what it is that you read. That's very different from writing a book report, for example. If you're going to read Moby Dick, and you're going to write a book report on Moby Dick or any other piece of literature that you read, a book report only requires you to basically summarize what was said. But you haven't done any analysis and you haven't had to synthesize it with anything. You're just reporting it. A website called From Now On refers to that as smushing. You read an article and you just gather pieces from it and you just lay it down and say, here's what I read. That is not critical thinking. To engage in critical thinking means you analyze, you take it apart. What are the themes? What are the main concepts that are discussed? What are the main findings? And then as you read other sources, you ask the same question, and then you start engaging in that synthesis process where you put the themes together. So the critical reading piece involves analyzing and synthesizing. It does not involve agreeing with an author, disagreeing with an author. It does not involve saying, I don't like what they say. Those ideas have no part in a critical thinking process. Analyzing, synthesizing, do. And then you're going to interpret that literature or that article. The next piece that we look at when we're looking at critical thinking will be, if I can move this one over here, inquiry. As you're reading, you're going to be asking questions. And as you're thinking, you're going to ask questions. The whole idea of analysis and comparisons, that's critical thinking. What are they saying? What are the main themes? Inquiry is really asking and finding out as you read. It involves different contexts. For example, is the article that you're reading one written with qualitative research, or is it about research done with quantitative? As you keep reading, it'll be involving comparing the evaluation of different positions and arguments. You're always going to be comparing and contrasting authors' views, authors' evidence, authors' arguments. And as you do that, again, that's the process of critical thinking as inquiry. Those are the processes that you're going to be engaging in as you read. And then looking finally at this one, the questions. So remember, you're going to engage in inquiry. These are some of the questions central to critical reading and thinking. And these are questions that you need to ask yourself as you're compiling your notes and you're thinking about what topic you might want to choose, what research question you want to choose. And as you start forming your own information, you're going to need to ask yourself some questions. For example, how honestly and impartially are you representing the other interpretations? A real important piece of critical thinking is to be very humble, to check your biases and assumptions at the door. Too often times we have seen students begin the process of the literature review and they've stated their research question or their research problem, but they have a preconceived notion about the results that they want to see because they're basing it on their previous assumptions. You have to be humble enough to check those at the door so that you can be impartial and honest as you're critically reading that source. Keep asking yourself, what evidence do I have? If you don't have the evidence and it's not in the source, you can't make a claim, and neither can the author. You can't say this is what the article said, or this is what the correct solution is if you don't have the evidence to support that. Critical thinking also involves admitting that you might not be done researching. You have to ask yourself, what additional information can help me narrow this down? What other information do I need to be able to have enough data or enough evidence to make a claim? So you can go back and review these, but remember that critical thinking is a set of skills that you have determined to engage in and to make your own. It's a process in which you will engage every time you need to make a decision and every time you read a professional article. It's the kind of skill that puts you in a position to be a teacher leader because you are the one willing to take the time and to go through the process of engaging in the critical thinking in order to come up with the best solution. Think, if you will, about some of the decisions that were made in your own school districts. Unfortunately, all of us can come up with an example, one of which I heard from a student this past semester. Their school had decided to engage in one-on-one technology. So every student had their own Chromebook. And then they made the decision to spend lots more money engaging in adapting some of the additional apps and programs for the Chromebooks. And before the mid-year, none of them were being used. Teachers were frustrated, students were frustrated, and the district was looking to moving on to something else. After many thousands of dollars were spent, many hours of wasted student time and wasted teacher time. And that happened because they did not take the time to engage in the critical reading of the research about these particular apps, or the research about the instructional practices of the apps, to know if they were even successful with improve student learning. And they didn't engage in the discourse that was needed from all the stakeholders in order to help make that decision. And so a quick fix solution was chosen, and all of that time, money, and student and teacher person energy was wasted. Schools can't afford to keep doing that, and we can't afford to keep thinking that way. And we certainly don't want to be responsible for promoting a solution to a problem if we haven't engaged in the critical thinking process, and that takes time and it takes dedication. And so we are encouraging you to take very seriously the opportunity in this class to learn the skills involved in critical reading and critical thinking, and then to make them part of who you are, so that you will engage in those practices every time a decision is made. Take time to review the information on critical thinking. There's also a handout that will be in the course listing the various chapters and that particularly involve critical thinking skills. So as you get to those chapters, it'll remind you of the kinds of skills in which you need to engage. So take the time again to study critical thinking, to take a look at the components, and then you will be reminded and encouraged and coached to use those as you continue in the course.